Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Sheriff Lucas Harper traded chaos for calm, he thought he'd found peace on his secluded Georgia homestead. But a clipboard-wielding HOA president named Karen has other plans, and she's about to learn that pushing the wrong man too far can awaken the lawman he once tried to leave behind. Lucas Harper had seen his fair share of chaos. As the newly elected sheriff of a quiet southern county in Georgia, he dealt with everything from meth labs in the woods to political power plays at City Hall. But all he really wanted now was peace. After 2 decades in law enforcement, Lucas had finally bought himself a piece of serenity, a rustic 2-story farmhouse on 5 acres of wooded land just outside the town of Briar Ridge. The property came with a large wraparound porch, an aging but sturdy barn, and plenty of room for his 2 German shepherds, Rusty and Boone, to run free. It was a dream realized, a quiet place to clear his head, maybe start that beekeeping hobby he'd always talked about, and finally escape the noise that had followed him his whole career. The house stood apart from the rest of the community. While the town itself had seen a boom in suburban development over the past decade, Lucas's land was part of an older parcel that predated the formation of the nearby Homeowners Association, Clearview Grove Estates. His property was bordered by dense pines on one side and a split-rail fence on the other, separating him from the pristine lawns and cookie-cutter homes of the HOA development that had sprung up to the east. Lucas liked it that way. His nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road, and he intended to keep things that way. Or so he thought. Within the first week of moving in, Lucas noticed a handful of curious glances from passing cars. A few homeowners from the neighboring development slowed down when they drove by his entrance, craning their necks to peek past the gate. He didn't think much of it. Small towns bred nosy people. But it wasn't long before a pair of neatly laminated notices appeared affixed to his mailbox and front gate. Reminder: exterior paint must be HOA-approved earth tones. Structures over 6 feet require pre-approval. Lucas chuckled, thinking it was some kind of mistake. Surely they didn't think his property was part of their tightly governed community. That assumption crumbled the day a woman in her 50s with frosted blonde hair, a clipboard, and the intensity of a tax auditor showed up at his front porch. She introduced herself with forced politeness as Karen Brady, president of the Clearview Grove HOA, and wasted no time launching into a list of non-compliance concerns. Lucas, puzzled but still courteous, explained that his property was not and had never been under the jurisdiction of the HOA. Karen's polite smile faltered. She insisted that all properties in the area were subject to the same community standards, and that as a resident of Clearview Grove, he was expected to comply. Her tone made it sound less like a suggestion and more like an order. Lucas didn't argue. Not yet. Instead, he offered a firm but calm explanation and showed her a copy of his deed, which clearly excluded his land from HOA boundaries. Karen left with a tight-lipped smile and the promise to verify everything. Lucas figured that was the end of it. He had no idea how wrong he was. A few days after their initial encounter, Lucas returned home from a long day at the station to find a bright orange violation notice taped to his front door. The paper was laminated, complete with the Clearview Grove HOA seal, and titled in bold uppercase letters, "Final Warning, Non-Compliant Structures and Unregistered Animals." It listed a host of absurd violations, including his barn being an eyesore, his beehives posing a community health risk, and his dogs, yes, his dogs, being potentially dangerous due to their size. Lucas read the notice twice, dumbfounded. It was laughable, almost surreal, but it made one thing clear. Karen hadn't simply brushed off their last meeting. She was doubling down. That Saturday morning, Lucas decided enough was enough. He wasn't one to escalate quickly, but this had crossed a line. He saddled up Rusty and Boone and took a stroll around his property, deliberately walking the perimeter near the border with Clearview Grove. It didn't take long for Karen to reappear. She emerged from behind a hedge like she'd been lying in wait, dressed in a Navy power suit and sunglasses, clipboard in hand and righteous fury radiating off her. "We need to have a conversation," she called out, her tone clipped and cold. Lucas stopped walking, folding his arms across his chest. "Already had one," he replied evenly. "Didn't seem to take." Karen marched toward him, high heels crunching over gravel. "You are in clear violation of the Clearview Grove Property Code, Mr. Harper. Your barn hasn't been inspected, your fence exceeds the height limit, and beekeeping is strictly forbidden due to allergy concerns among residents." She flipped through her clipboard dramatically, then looked up with a scowl. "I'm giving you until the end of the week to bring your property into compliance, or I'll have no choice but to escalate." Lucas let out a slow breath, reining in his temper. "Karen," he said calmly, "I am not part of Clearview Grove. This land is not, has never been, and never will be under HOA control. I've shown you the deed. You have no authority here." Karen's mouth twitched, her voice rising. "That land touches Clearview Grove. We have jurisdictional influence." "Influence doesn't mean legal authority," Lucas shot back. "And if you or anyone from your association steps foot on this property again to harass me, I will treat it as trespassing. And unlike most people, I don't have to call the sheriff. I am the sheriff." The moment the words left his mouth, Karen's demeanor shifted. She flinched ever so slightly, the clipboard sagging in her arms. But the arrogance didn't leave her eyes. She straightened, tried to regain control of the moment. "We'll see about that," she said, turning on her heel. "I have friends on the county board." Lucas didn't respond. He watched her retreat across the property line, her back stiff, her pace quickening. He knew her type. People who thought rules were a weapon they alone could wield. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The peace didn't last long. Just 2 days after Lucas's sharp exchange with Karen, things took a darker turn. He awoke one morning to the sound of frantic barking. Rusty and Boone were going wild by the back window. Lucas threw on a flannel and stepped out onto the porch, his heart dropping at the sight before him. His bee yard, carefully fenced off behind his barn, was in shambles. 3 of the hives had been knocked over, frames cracked and honey pooling into the dirt. Wooden panels were scattered like debris from a storm, and the metal gate to the enclosure hung awkwardly off one hinge. He moved quickly, inspecting the damage, heart pounding not just from anger, but concern. This wasn't the work of animals. Someone had done this. As he walked the edge of the property, Lucas spotted deep tire tracks cutting across the side yard, leading in from the direction of Clearview Grove. They'd come in under the cover of night, through a patch of woods where the old fencing hadn't been replaced yet. The message was clear. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was sabotage. Whether it was an attempt to scare him off or provoke him into action, it had just crossed the line from annoying to criminal. Lucas returned inside and pulled up the footage from his newly installed trail cams. Sure enough, at 3:14 a.m., 2 men in uniforms bearing the Clearview Property Services logo appeared on screen. They walked directly to the hives, flashlight beams flickering, and started dismantling the setup with crowbars. One of them laughed. Lucas's jaw clenched as he paused the video, face tight with restrained fury. It was time to start documenting everything. No more warnings. The next day, he contacted the sheriff's department, not as sheriff, but as a private citizen, and filed an official vandalism complaint. Then he paid a visit to the county recorder's office, where he requested the most recent HOA filings from Clearview Grove. As he suspected, their jurisdiction map stopped a solid 200 feet before his property line. There was no easement, no overlap, no loophole. Still, Karen and her inner circle had taken it upon themselves to enforce community standards on land that wasn't theirs. The following week brought more brazen provocations. A contractor showed up unannounced in a white pickup truck, claiming he was there to begin corrective landscaping per an HOA work order. When Lucas pressed for paperwork, the man hesitated, then handed over a flimsy printout titled Exterior Order 31B, Grounds Restoration Enforcement Directive. It wasn't signed, it wasn't dated, and it was riddled with typos. Lucas read it silently, then folded it and tucked it into his back pocket. "You step 1 foot on that property, I'll consider it criminal trespass," Lucas said flatly. The contractor backed off quickly, muttering something about just following orders before peeling out of the driveway. But the warning signs were clear. Karen wasn't going to stop, and she was dragging others into her crusade. Lucas doubled his efforts. He installed a new row of motion-activated floodlights along the forest edge and mounted high-res cameras on both corners of the barn. He began compiling a thick folder of documentation, videos, photos, statements, fake notices, all organized and time-stamped. He knew this wasn't over. In fact, he had a feeling it was about to explode. The tension finally snapped one humid Thursday morning when the line between nuisance and danger was obliterated in a single, reckless act. Lucas had spent most of the early hours on patrol, handling a minor domestic call in the northern end of the county. He returned home just after 10 a.m., looking forward to a cup of black coffee and a quiet hour with his dogs. Instead, he pulled into his driveway and froze. A silver SUV was parked just beyond his front gate. Two unfamiliar men, both in branded polo shirts with Clearview Grove's HOA logo, were already on his property, walking toward his barn with clipboards and measuring tape in hand. Lucas's eyes narrowed. One of them was even taking pictures of the beehives, which he had just spent the weekend restoring. He hadn't received a single call or warning about this visit, and certainly no permission had been granted. The air around him tightened. He stepped out of his cruiser slowly, wearing his uniform from earlier that morning. "Hey," he called sharply. "You two, drop the gear and step back. This is private land." The men looked up, startled. One hesitated, the other immediately started retreating toward the SUV. "We were just sent to inspect the structure for safety." "You're trespassing," Lucas snapped, advancing. "No permit, no authority, no prior notice. You're done here." Before they could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air like a blade. "Sheriff Harper, there's no need for hostility," Karen Brady said smoothly as she rounded the corner from the side of the barn. She was dressed in a tailored navy suit, oversized sunglasses glinting in the sun, and a smug expression pasted across her face. "You know very well that these inspections are standard procedure. Our board approved a motion last week to formally assess your structures and enforce compliance. I assumed you'd be grateful for our support in bringing your property up to community expectations." Lucas took a step toward her, his voice low and deliberate. "Karen, I have warned you. You do not have jurisdiction here. You and your board are in violation of several county ordinances by sending people onto my land without consent. This ends now." Karen's jaw tightened. She reached into her designer bag, not slowly, not cautiously, but with sharp purpose, and in a motion so fast it stunned everyone present, pulled out a small black pistol and pointed it directly at Lucas. "Don't you raise your voice at me," she snarled. "You think being sheriff makes you untouchable? I'm not afraid of your badge. People like you think you can just move in and do whatever you want. Well, not here. You want a war? You've got one." For a fraction of a second, the world stood still. The two HOA contractors stood frozen in horror. Even the breeze seemed to halt. Lucas didn't flinch. Years of law enforcement training took over. In one swift, controlled movement, he sidestepped, drew his service weapon, and barked, "Drop it now!" Karen didn't move fast enough. Lucas lunged, expertly disarming her and twisting her arm behind her back before she could blink. The pistol hit the gravel with a metallic thud. Her sunglasses flew off. She screamed in fury, trying to pull away, but Lucas already had her face down in the dirt, cuffing her with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times. "You are under arrest for felony assault with a deadly weapon, criminal trespass, and brandishing a firearm in the commission of a crime," he said, his voice as cold and sharp as steel. "You have the right to remain silent." Karen screamed at the top of her lungs, calling him a liar, a thug, a fascist, but her words dissolved into the humid air as backup units roared up the gravel road. The contractors were questioned and released. The firearm, an unregistered weapon, was bagged as evidence. Karen, red-faced and fuming, was placed in the back of a patrol car, still spitting venom. Lucas stood in the silence that followed, hands on his hips, heart pounding slower now. The line had been crossed. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was war. News of Karen Brady's arrest spread through Briar Ridge like wildfire. Within hours, local headlines screamed, "HOA president arrested after pulling gun on county sheriff." The story went viral before sundown, and Lucas's phone lit up with calls from media outlets, city council members, and furious Clearview Grove residents alike. But Lucas had no time for reporters or public opinion. He had work to do, because Karen's gun wasn't the real story. Not anymore. After securing the arrest report, Lucas contacted the district attorney and the county magistrate judge to request an emergency search warrant. With the footage from his trail cameras, the fake violation notices, and Karen's own recorded threats, the case for further investigation was solid. By the next morning, he and two deputies served the warrant at the Clearview Grove HOA office, a rented suite in a bland strip mall off Route 22. What they found inside was damning. Filing cabinets were packed with unofficial citations, most of them targeting residents who'd questioned the board's authority. Lucas uncovered a handwritten ledger containing undocumented fees collected in cash, marked with initials, dates, and cryptic notes like compliance penalty or patio variance surcharge. Even more disturbing were forged inspection documents, altered zoning maps, and fabricated letters from supposed county officials, some bearing names of actual people who had never authorized a thing. Karen's office contained a desktop computer loaded with spreadsheets of private homeowner data, income levels, political affiliations, even children's names and schools, used, it seemed, to apply pressure on those who resisted the board's standards. In a locked drawer, they found a stack of pre-signed violation letters and blank fine slips, ready to be customized at a moment's notice. The scope of it stunned even Lucas. This wasn't just obsessive overreach. It was a systematic campaign of intimidation and fraud, run under the guise of neighborhood order. Over the next 48 hours, 3 other members of the HOA board were brought in for questioning. One flipped immediately, revealing that Karen had been funneling HOA funds to pay for everything from personal landscaping to luxury spa retreats. Another admitted to forging signatures on voting records for board elections. Lucas compiled everything into a comprehensive criminal file and turned it over to the DA's office. Multiple felony charges were drafted: fraud, conspiracy, unlawful surveillance, financial misappropriation, and, of course, felony assault with a deadly weapon. Karen's war wasn't just over, she was going to prison. The trial began 3 months later, and by then, the story had outgrown Briar Ridge. National media outlets descended on the small Georgia town, dubbing it the HOA from Hell's case. News vans lined the courthouse lawn. Headlines painted Karen Brady as the poster child for suburban tyranny, a power-drunk board president who pulled a gun on a sheriff and presided over one of the most corrupt homeowners associations the state had ever seen. Karen arrived at court each day with a rotating squad of attorneys and an expression that fluctuated between righteous indignation and thinly veiled panic. She pleaded not guilty to all charges, of course, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, that she'd felt threatened by Lucas on her own HOA's property. But that argument fell apart quickly, especially when the prosecution played the footage from Lucas's body cam, where Karen had clearly invaded his land and raised her weapon without provocation. The courtroom was packed every day with residents from Clearview Grove, some there out of curiosity, others seeking justice. Witness after witness took the stand telling similar stories. Threats of fines, forced improvements billed to their accounts, bogus citations that arrived anytime someone asked too many questions. A retired teacher recounted how she'd been penalized for having non-compliant curtains. A single father described being reported to Child Services after challenging a new HOA fee. The pattern was unmistakable and chilling. Lucas testified on the third day. Calm, composed, and unwavering, he described the timeline in detail: the trespassing, the sabotage, the confrontation, the weapon. When asked by the DA why he hadn't simply used his badge to shut the HOA down earlier, he replied, "I didn't want to be the man who abused his power, but when someone else abuses theirs, it's my job to stop it." Karen's defense tried to paint Lucas as aggressive, insinuated he moved to the neighborhood looking for a fight. But that argument didn't last long under cross-examination, especially not after Lucas's legal team submitted land survey maps, title deeds, and all the footage he'd painstakingly gathered. Dates, times, faces. Evidence didn't lie. In the end, the jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Karen Brady was found guilty on all major counts: felony assault with a deadly weapon, criminal conspiracy, financial fraud, and unlawful surveillance. The judge, clearly incensed by the breadth of her abuses, sentenced her to 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6. As the sentence was read, Karen sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her lawyers whispered furiously, but the reality had sunk in. Her empire of rules and fear had crumbled. And Lucas. He walked out of that courtroom to a standing ovation. In the months that followed the trial, Clearview Grove underwent a transformation no one could have predicted. With Karen and several other board members either in custody or under investigation, the Homeowners Association was placed under court-appointed supervision. A mediator, along with a new interim board made up of actual residents, not self-appointed tyrants, was tasked with restoring order and rebuilding trust. Gone were the intimidating letters, bogus fees, and midnight inspections. For the first time in years, the neighborhood began to breathe. Lucas was asked to consult during the restructuring process, though he politely declined any official role. He made it clear he didn't want control, he only wanted boundaries respected and decency restored. Still, his advice was heeded. The new board adopted a clear, limited charter ensuring no homeowner would ever again be targeted without due process. Meetings became open, transparent, and even, dare it be said, cordial. Lucas noticed the change almost immediately. People who had once kept their heads down now greeted him with genuine warmth. The family 2 lots down brought over fresh peach cobbler as thanks. Elderly neighbors who'd been too afraid to complain under Karen's reign now invited him over for Sunday coffee. His once contentious presence in the area was now welcomed and even admired. On his own land, Lucas finally returned to the peace he'd envisioned when he first bought the place. The hives buzzed steadily at the edge of the clearing, flourishing with the wildflowers he'd planted. Rusty and Boone lounged on the porch most afternoons, tails thumping lazily at the sound of approaching visitors. The barn had been restored, the fencing fortified. Floodlights and cameras remained, of course. He was no fool, but they stood more as reminders than defenses. One warm Saturday evening, as the sun dipped low over the tree line, Lucas hosted a small neighborhood cookout. It wasn't advertised, no flyers, just word of mouth passed among those who had supported him, who had stood up and spoken out. People came with lawn chairs and homemade dishes, kids darted between tables with sparklers, and someone brought a guitar that played long after the food ran out. At one point, the new HOA president, a mild-mannered school librarian named Denise, raised a toast. To Lucas Harper, she said, smiling, for reminding us that the law is supposed to protect people, not control them. The crowd clapped, some raising red solo cups. Lucas just nodded, modest but grateful. It hadn't been about glory. It had been about drawing a line and saying, no farther. As the stars came out and fireflies lit the treetops, Lucas leaned back in his chair, a glass of sweet tea in hand, and took in the sound of laughter and music echoing across his once quiet land. This was how a community was supposed to feel. A full year had passed since the day Karen Brady was led away in handcuffs. Her reign of HOA terror officially ended. In that time, Briar Ridge had returned to the quiet, sun-drenched rhythm Lucas Harper had hoped for when he first moved in. The local paper occasionally printed retrospectives on the now infamous case, but for the most part, the town had moved on, healing, rebuilding, and rediscovering its sense of neighborly decency. Lucas had moved on too, though traces of the battle lingered like old scars, reminders of what happens when power is left unchecked. His property had become something of a symbol, not just of resistance, but of restoration. Where once neighbors eyed his fence warily, they now admired the orderly rows of wildflowers growing along it. His beekeeping venture had grown beyond hobby status. With over a dozen thriving hives, Lucas had officially launched a small business, Harper's Honey. The labels, designed by a local art student, featured a simple logo, just a honeybee perched on a sheriff's badge. Locals loved it. Farmers markets sold out weekly. Restaurants across the county began ordering jars in bulk. But more importantly, it gave Lucas a new connection to his neighbors, one built not on confrontation, but collaboration. He offered free jars to the elementary school's science program, held a beekeeping demo at the summer fair, and even let the local Girl Scout troop name one of the queen bees. One afternoon, while labeling fresh jars in the barn, Lucas heard footsteps on gravel. He looked up to find a teenage boy, probably 16, skinny, nervous, standing at the edge of the porch. "You the sheriff?" the boy asked, voice cracking slightly. Lucas smiled. "That's me." The kid hesitated. "My mom says you once arrested a lady for telling you to move your fence." Lucas chuckled. "Not exactly. She pulled a gun on me, over zoning regulations." The boy's eyes widened. "Whoa, that's kinda badass." Lucas laughed and handed him a jar of honey. "Tell your mom I said hi. And keep your fences locked." Word had gotten around, not just about the arrest or the trial, but the principle behind it, that no one, not even the president of an HOA, was above the law. Parents used the story to teach their kids about standing up to bullies. Town officials took a second look at their own neighborhood governance, and homeowners across the region quietly reviewed their HOA bylaws just to be sure. As autumn rolled in, Lucas found himself sitting on the porch more often, boots up, dogs at his feet, bees humming somewhere in the distance. The golden light spilled across his fields, brushing the tops of the trees, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't in years: contentment. He wasn't just respected now, he was trusted, and not because he'd worn a badge or arrested the town's most infamous tyrant, but because he'd drawn the line where it mattered and held it firmly and fairly. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the shadows lengthened across the porch, Lucas took a sip of sweet tea, watching a family walk their dog along the gravel path beside his land. They waved. He waved back. Justice had been served. The land was peaceful, and the honey sweet as ever.